United States, 2023. Part 1. The Fortress of Reason. The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation as students hurried to find their seats, their murmurs filling the large, imposing room. High-arched windows let in the pale Boston sunlight, casting long shadows across rows of wooden desks. The air smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee, a familiar scent in this corner of Boston University. At the center of it all stood Thomas O'Connell, tall, poised, and fiercely intelligent. His reputation as one of the most brilliant philosophers of the modern era was well-earned, and he carried himself like a man who had never questioned his own convictions. Thomas's dark suit was pressed to perfection, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he stood by the podium, preparing for yet another lecture. There was a magnetic tension in the room, a palpable sense that what was about to be said would challenge the very core of some students' beliefs. For many, attending one of Thomas's philosophy classes was a rite of passage, a plunge into the deep, uncharted waters of existential thought. Thomas did not simply teach philosophy. He dismantled it, layer by layer, cutting away what he deemed irrelevant, most notably, any notion of the divine. The moment the clock struck the hour, Thomas's voice sliced through the quiet hum. "Let's talk about illusion," he began, his tone crisp and assured. The room fell silent, and every pair of eyes locked onto him. "Faith," he said, pausing for effect, "is the greatest illusion of all." He moved to the chalkboard, his back to the students as he scribbled a series of philosophical terms, each word a foundation of his worldview. "Throughout history," he continued, turning to face them, "human beings have sought to understand the mysteries of existence. And when logic and reason failed them, they turned to faith, a concept born of fear and ignorance." His words hung in the air like a challenge. For years, Thomas had delivered this lecture, refining it with each iteration. His arguments were elegant, seamless, and devastating to those unprepared to confront the uncomfortable idea that perhaps, just perhaps, there was no divine plan. The students listened intently, many nodding along, some furiously jotting notes, but one face in particular stood out: Sarah Dawson. Seated in the middle of the room, Sarah was one of the few students who dared to meet Thomas's gaze without flinching. Her notebook lay untouched on the desk, her arms crossed, and her expression determined. Sarah was a Christian, an openly devout one. Unlike many of her peers, she wasn't afraid to voice her faith, even in an environment where skepticism reigned supreme. Thomas knew her well. She had, on several occasions, engaged him in debates during office hours, her quiet confidence clashing with his intellectual rigor. He admired her conviction, though he viewed it as misplaced. "In this class, we deal with facts," Thomas said, his gaze briefly meeting Sarah's. "Not comforting fictions." The room felt heavy with tension. The students waited for Sarah to respond, but she remained silent, her eyes never leaving Thomas's. He pressed on, his voice growing louder, more impassioned. "Science and philosophy have given us the tools to understand the world. We don't need myths or gods to explain what we cannot yet comprehend. We simply need to push the boundaries of our knowledge further." As the lecture continued, Thomas effortlessly dissected arguments for the existence of God, drawing on centuries of philosophical thought. His intellect was like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, slicing through centuries-old doctrines as if they were paper. He wove logic with historical context, explaining how human civilization had clung to faith as a means of survival, an evolutionary coping mechanism. Yet now, he argued, humanity had evolved beyond the need for such crutches. After 2 hours of relentless debate, Thomas concluded the lecture, his final words echoing in the room. "Faith is the antithesis of reason, and reason is the only path to truth." The students erupted into applause, many of them clearly awestruck by his command of the subject. But not Sarah. She remained seated, her face unreadable, as the rest of the class packed their bags and shuffled out. Thomas noticed her stillness, though he didn't address it. In his mind, This was a battle of ideas, and Sarah's silence was a quiet concession. But he was wrong. Later that afternoon, Tomas sat in his office, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating the stacks of books and papers that surrounded him. His office was a reflection of his mind, structured, meticulous, with shelves lined with the works of Nietzsche, Kant, and Hume. Every item had its place, much like his beliefs. He leaned back in his leather chair, flipping through a book on ethics when a soft knock interrupted his solitude. It was Sarah. She stood at the doorway, her posture relaxed but her expression resolute. "May I come in?" she asked. Tomas motioned for her to enter. "I've been thinking about today's lecture," she began, taking a seat opposite him. Her voice was calm but firm. "And I understand your perspective. You make compelling arguments, as always." Tomas raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her approach. "But," he prompted. "But," Sarah continued, "there are things that logic and reason can't explain. And I think, deep down, you know that. You talk about faith as though it's only a product of fear. But faith is also about love, hope, and things we can't measure in a lab or prove with a syllogism." Tomas leaned forward, his interest piqued. "And you believe that love and hope are evidence of God's existence?" "I believe they're evidence of something greater than ourselves," Sarah said, her gaze unwavering. "Just because you can't quantify something doesn't mean it isn't real." For a moment, Tomas was silent, considering her words. In another time, another place, he might have dismissed her argument as nothing more than wishful thinking. But something about Sarah's quiet conviction gave him pause. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. There was a sincerity in her voice that he couldn't ignore. "You're free to believe whatever you want, Sarah," Tomas said, leaning back in his chair. "But I deal with facts. And until I see evidence of something greater, I'll stick to what can be proven." Sarah stood, nodding respectfully. "I hope one day you find what you're looking for, Professor." Her words lingered in the air long after she left his office, like a thread woven into the fabric of his thoughts. Tomas turned back to his book, but the words blurred on the page. For the first time in years, something had unsettled him, something that logic couldn't quite resolve. He pushed the thought aside, refocusing on his work, but a seed had been planted. And in the stillness of his office, as the sun began to set over the Boston skyline, Tomas found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he had missed something. The fortress of reason, once impenetrable, now had a crack. Part 2. Shadows of Loss. The warmth of summer had given way to the chilling winds of October. Boston streets were lined with fallen leaves, their vibrant colors fading as the days grew colder. But none of this registered for Tomas. He sat motionless on the edge of his leather couch, staring blankly at the flickering light of the television, though he hadn't turned it on in days. His living room, once a space filled with the light-hearted conversations and laughter he shared with Amanda, now felt more like a tomb, a silent reminder of everything he had lost. The once meticulously kept space had become a disarray of unopened mail, discarded books, and untouched dishes. The walls that had once been decorated with Amanda's touch, soft cream-colored curtains, family photos from vacations they had taken, and framed artwork they had chosen together, now felt oppressive, like they were closing in on him. Everything in the room was a relic of a life that no longer existed. Amanda's absence was suffocating, her memory haunting every corner of the home they had shared. Tomas hadn't returned to work since the accident. His colleagues had been understanding, offering condolences and giving him time to grieve, but grief wasn't something Tomas understood. It wasn't logical. There was no reasoning that could explain the gaping hole in his heart or the relentless sorrow that washed over him in waves. He felt disconnected from everything, his career, his friends, even himself. In the quiet hours of the night, when sleep eluded him, Tomas would often find himself wandering through their home, his fingers brushing over Amanda's belongings, as if touching them might somehow bring her back. The accident had been sudden, brutal in its unexpectedness. One moment, Amanda had been there, alive, vibrant, full of laughter. The next, she was gone. Tomas had replayed the night in his mind 1,000 times. She had been on her way back from visiting a friend across town. A simple drive, a routine evening, until the phone call that changed everything. "Mr. O'Connell, I'm afraid we have some bad news." The officer's voice had been clinical, detached, as if delivering a report. Tomas had listened in a daze, the words not registering until much later. Amanda had been struck by another vehicle, an accident caused by a reckless driver. She hadn't survived. And just like that, the axis of Tomas's world had shifted, throwing him into a void of despair he had never anticipated. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, condolences from friends and colleagues, and endless phone calls from relatives offering their support. But Tomas had retreated inward, unable to process their words, unable to accept their sympathy. Every "I'm sorry" felt hollow. Every "she's in a better place" made him seethe with an anger he couldn't quite articulate. A better place? What better place could there be than here with him? On one particularly cold afternoon, Tomas sat alone in their bedroom, the bed unmade, Amanda's favorite sweater still draped across the chair where she had left it. He held her wedding ring in his hand, its weight heavy against his palm. It was a simple gold band, worn down from years of use, yet it felt like the most precious thing he owned. Tomas clenched it tightly, his knuckles turning white as he fought the tears that threatened to spill over. He had never been one to cry. Even as a child, Tomas had prided himself on his stoicism, his ability to maintain control in the face of adversity. But now, all that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. He had built his life around logic and reason, creating a fortress in which nothing irrational or emotional could penetrate. But the fortress had crumbled the moment Amanda's heart stopped beating. The nights were the worst. Tomas had never imagined how quiet the world could become without Amanda beside him. The absence of her voice, her laughter, her presence, it was unbearable. He would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what could have been, what should have been. Grief gnawed at him, hollowing him out from the inside. He had no answers, no explanations, and it terrified him. For the first time in his life, Tomas didn't know how to move forward. He stopped leaving the house, stopped answering calls, and avoided even the simplest of interactions. His world had shrunk to the confines of their home, now a mausoleum of memories. Food lost its taste, and sleep became a distant memory. He existed in a liminal space, somewhere between the life he had once known and the void that had replaced it. Every moment without Amanda was agony. Then came the anger. At first it was subtle, a slow burn in the pit of his stomach. But as the days turned into weeks, it grew more intense, more volatile. Tomas found himself snapping at the smallest of things. An unopened letter from a colleague, the sound of the neighbor's dog barking, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Everything felt like an insult, a reminder that the world continued on without Amanda, as if her absence meant nothing. One evening, Tomas stood in the living room, staring at a photograph of them taken years ago on vacation. They were smiling, their arms wrapped around each other, the ocean stretching out behind them. It was one of his favorite memories, a moment of pure happiness. In a sudden fit of rage, he threw the frame across the room, watching as it shattered against the wall, glass splintering across the floor. The outburst left him breathless, his chest heaving as he stared at the broken frame. But even that act of destruction brought no relief. The anger remained, festering, feeding on his sorrow. And beneath the anger, there was something else, something far more unsettling. Doubt. Tomas had spent his entire life believing in the certainty of logic, the infallibility of reason. But now, in the wake of Amanda's death, none of it made sense. What was the purpose of life if it could be ripped away so easily, so cruelly? Why had Amanda, of all people, been taken? She had been kind, compassionate, the light in his otherwise cynical world. Her death was senseless, random. There was no reason behind it, no logic to explain it. For the first time, Tomas found himself questioning everything he had built his life upon. His philosophical arguments, his carefully crafted worldview. None of it could provide comfort in the face of such overwhelming loss. The certainty he had once felt, the confidence in his beliefs, was slipping away, leaving behind a void that he didn't know how to fill. The thought of God, of faith, crept into his mind, unbidden and unwanted. He dismissed it at first, as he had always done. Faith was for the weak, for those who couldn't face reality. But now, reality was too painful to face, and Tomas began to wonder if perhaps there was something more, something he had been too proud to consider. As the days wore on, Tomas's isolation deepened. His world had become a prison of grief and unanswered questions. He no longer recognized himself in the mirror, the man who stared back at him gaunt and hollow-eyed. The once brilliant professor, revered for his intellect and unwavering beliefs, was now a broken shell of the man he had been. And in the silence of his home, Tomas felt the first stirrings of something he had never known before: the need for hope. Part 3. The Whisper in the Dark. The room was bathed in the dim, silvery light of a stormy night. Rain pattered relentlessly against the windows, casting ghostly reflections on the walls as the wind howled like a distant, mournful cry. Tomas lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, his body motionless but his mind racing. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, yet sleep remained elusive, teasing him with moments of near unconsciousness before snapping him back into the oppressive reality of his grief. It had been weeks since Amanda's death, but the pain felt just as fresh, just as unbearable. The nights had become his torment. While the world slept, Tomas wrestled with the weight of his sorrow, the stillness of his home amplifying every thought, every doubt. He had become a prisoner of his own mind, trapped in an endless loop of questions without answers. What had once been his sanctuary, his bedroom, the place where he and Amanda shared their most intimate moments, had turned into a battleground for his soul. His gaze flickered over to Amanda's side of the bed. Her pillow still rested in its place, untouched, as if saving the space for her return. But she wasn't coming back. Tomas clenched his fists at the thought, feeling the familiar surge of anger rising within him, quickly followed by despair. His heart ached in ways he couldn't describe, and no philosophy, no logic could ease the agony. He was drowning in it. As the wind outside picked up, the room seemed to grow colder, and Tomas pulled the blanket closer to his chest. But it wasn't the cold that bothered him. It was the silence, the unbearable, deafening silence that had taken over his life since Amanda's passing. No laughter, no conversations, not even the faint sound of her footsteps in the hallway. Just silence. For a man who had always thrived in the clarity of logic and reason, Tomas now found himself lost in the chaos of his emotions. He no longer knew who he was. The intellectual fortress he had spent decades building had crumbled the moment Amanda left this world. His mind, once sharp and controlled, now felt like a jumbled mess of contradictions. He questioned everything: his career, his beliefs, his very existence. And then there was Sarah. Her words from their last conversation haunted him, echoing in the recesses of his mind when he least expected them. God is with you, whether you believe it or not. He had dismissed her sentiment at the time, but now, alone in the darkness, it gnawed at him. Could there be something he was missing? Could there be more to life than what his intellect allowed him to believe? Suddenly, Tomas sat up, frustrated with himself. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, breathing heavily. This wasn't him. This wasn't who he was. He wasn't some fragile man who turned to religion in times of crisis. He had spent his entire life disproving the existence of God, relying on reason and evidence, not superstition. He wasn't going to change now, was he? Yet the doubt lingered. The questions festered, and as much as Tomas tried to ignore it, something inside him had shifted. It was in that moment, as he sat in the oppressive silence, that he heard it. A voice, soft, yet unmistakable. A whisper, like a breath of wind moving through the room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "I am with you, Tomas." His heart stopped. Every muscle in his body tensed, his breath caught in his throat. He blinked, his eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the sound. But he was alone. He had been alone for weeks. It must have been his imagination, he told himself. Grief playing tricks on his mind. That's all it was. People heard things in moments of extreme emotional distress, didn't they? He tried to reason it away, tried to convince himself that it was nothing more than a hallucination, a figment of his exhausted brain. But no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it, the voice lingered. "I am with you." Tomas's hands began to tremble. He pressed them to his forehead, squeezing his eyes shut as if that could block out the voice. He wasn't going crazy, was he? It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the voice felt so real, so vivid. He could feel it resonate deep within his chest, as though it were coming from inside him, not from the outside world. For the first time in his life, Tomas felt truly afraid. Not of death, not of loss, but of something far more unsettling. The possibility that everything he had spent his life denying could be true. What if God was real? What if there was something beyond this life, beyond the physical world he had so fiercely defended? He stood abruptly, pacing the room, his mind racing. The rational part of him was screaming, desperate to hold on to what he knew, to what made sense. But another part, a part he had long buried, was starting to emerge. A part that was open to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have all the answers. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rumbling in the distance as the rain pounded against the windows. Tomas moved to the window, staring out into the darkness, his reflection staring back at him. The man in the glass looked older than he remembered, more tired, more worn. He barely recognized himself anymore. And then, without warning, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but the words came out before he could stop them. Is this real? He wasn't sure who he was asking. God? Himself? The universe? He didn't know. He just needed to say it, to release the question that had been building inside him for weeks. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of the rain and the storm raging outside. But then, just as suddenly as before, the voice returned. Yes, Tomas. The answer sent a shockwave through him. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his back against the cold wall. Tears that he had fought so hard to suppress began to flow freely, sobs racking his body. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing months of pent-up grief, anger, and confusion. He cried for Amanda, for the life they had lost, for the man he had been and the man he no longer knew how to be. And in the midst of his sobs, the voice spoke again. You are not alone. Tomas pressed his face into his hands, shaking with emotion. He wanted to deny it, wanted to hold on to the certainty he had always known. But something inside him, something deeper than logic or reason, told him that this was real, that he wasn't imagining it. For the first time in his life, Tomas felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before: faith. It was small, fragile, and uncertain, but it was there, like a flicker of light in the darkness. He didn't understand it, didn't know what it meant, but in that moment, it was enough. As the storm raged on outside, Tomas sat on the floor of his bedroom, his heart pounding, his mind spinning. The voice had gone silent, but its presence remained, like a comforting warmth that he couldn't explain. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know what would come next. But for the first time since Amanda's death, Tomas felt a sliver of hope. And that was enough to get him through the night. Part 4. The Light Through Stained Glass. The sound of soft hymns floated through the still air as Tomas stood at the entrance of the small church, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been there before, outside the old brick building with its steeple that rose high into the Boston sky, but this time felt different. Heavy, laden with expectation. The warm glow of light from the stained glass windows spilled onto the street, casting vibrant colors across the cracked sidewalk beneath his feet. Tomas stood frozen for a moment, his hand gripping the handle of the large wooden door. Every part of him wanted to turn around, to walk back to the safety of his home and retreat into the familiar world of logic and reason. Yet, something within him, something fragile but undeniable, drew him inside. The memory of the voice from that stormy night still lingered in his mind, a constant whisper in the back of his thoughts. I am with you. The words had haunted him, shaken him to his core, and now they had led him here. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the sanctuary. As Tomas stepped into the church, the warmth of the space enveloped him like a comforting embrace. The scent of burning candles mixed with polished wood filled the air, and the quiet murmur of prayers could be heard in the distance. He had never been inside a church before, not like this. The grandeur of it was simple yet beautiful, with its vaulted ceilings, wooden pews, and rows of flickering candles along the altar. But what struck Tomas the most were the windows. The stained glass depicted vivid scenes from biblical stories, stories he had once dismissed as mere fables. He hesitated near the back, unsure of what to do or where to sit. A small congregation was scattered throughout the pews, most of them elderly, their heads bowed in silent prayer. He felt out of place, an intruder in a world he had spent his entire life rejecting. Yet here he was, searching for something he couldn't even name. The weight of grief still pressed heavily on his shoulders, but there was a new emotion stirring within him, one he hadn't felt since Amanda's death. Hope! Tomas took a tentative step forward, then another, until he found himself seated near the middle of the church. He could feel the eyes of a few parishioners glance his way, but they quickly returned to their prayers. No one approached him. No one asked why he was there. For that, Tomas was grateful. He wasn't ready to answer that question himself. The soft sound of footsteps echoed from the front of the church as the pastor stepped up to the pulpit. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, his graying hair combed back neatly. He looked over the congregation with warmth, as if he knew each of them personally. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost soothing. "Today, we speak of grace," the pastor began, his voice carrying through the church. "Grace that is undeserved, unearned, yet freely given by God. It is a love that knows no limits, a forgiveness that has no conditions." Tomas listened, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze fixed on the stained glass windows. He wasn't sure what he had expected to feel upon entering the church. Maybe guilt, maybe shame for all the years he had spent ridiculing faith. But instead, he felt peace. It was subtle, like a gentle wave washing over him. But it was there. The pastor's words flowed like water, not trying to convince or persuade, but simply offering understanding. "There are times in life when we feel lost," the pastor continued, his voice growing softer. "When the pain we carry seems too great and the burdens we bear feel too heavy. It is in those moments that grace meets us, not in judgment, but in love." The words resonated deeply within Tomas, stirring something inside him that he couldn't explain. It was as if the pastor was speaking directly to him, to the broken man sitting quietly in the middle of the church, still grappling with the loss of his wife and the crumbling of his beliefs. As the service continued, Tomas found himself lost in thought. The voice he had heard that night in his bedroom, the overwhelming sense of presence that had followed, it hadn't left him. It had followed him here, nudging him towards something he had spent his life resisting. And now, sitting in this small church, surrounded by the soft glow of candlelight and the warmth of prayer, Tomas began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this was where he was meant to be. After the service, as the congregation slowly filtered out of the church, Tomas remained seated. He watched as the elderly parishioners gathered near the entrance, exchanging quiet conversations, their faces lit with joy and kindness. He didn't know why, but he didn't want to leave. Not yet. There was something about the quietness of the church, the feeling of stillness that he hadn't experienced in months, that made him want to stay just a little longer. It was then that Tomas felt a familiar presence nearby. He turned his head and saw Sarah, standing a few rows behind him. She hadn't approached him during the service, giving him the space he needed. But now, as the last of the congregation exited the church, she walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. "Professor," she said softly as she reached him. There was no surprise in her voice, no curiosity as to why he was there. It was as if she had expected him all along. Tomas nodded, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to feeling so vulnerable, so raw. But here, in this place, with Sarah standing in front of him, words seemed unnecessary. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle. Tomas hesitated, his eyes drifting to the stained glass window beside them. The image was of Christ, his arms open wide, a look of serenity on his face. For so long, Tomas had scoffed at such images, dismissing them as symbols of a misguided belief. But now, looking at the figure in the window, he felt something he had never expected: comfort. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm doing here." Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph or satisfaction. It was a smile of understanding. "You don't have to know. Sometimes, it's enough just to be here." Tomas looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since Amanda's death, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It wasn't certainty, far from it, but it was the beginning of something. A crack in the wall he had built around himself, letting in the smallest glimmer of light. They stood in silence for a moment, the soft hum of the church around them. Outside, the storm had passed, and the sky was beginning to clear. Tomas could see the first hints of sunlight breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the floor of the church. "I'm not sure I believe," Tomas finally said, his voice quiet but steady. Sarah nodded. "That's okay. Belief isn't something that happens all at once. It's a journey." Tomas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. A journey. He had always thought of belief as something rigid, something you either had or didn't have. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was something that grew, something that needed time. "Thank you," he said, meeting her gaze. "For not giving up on me." Sarah's smile widened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Tomas smiled back. As they left the church together, Tomas felt the warmth of the sun on his face, the light filtering through the clouds. It wasn't the end of his journey, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. Part 5. Rebirth and Truth. The lecture hall at Boston University had always been a place of intellectual rigor, a sanctuary for sharp debate and unwavering logic. Today, however, the atmosphere felt different. The familiar setting of high ceilings, rows of desks, and the faint smell of chalk was unchanged, but there was something new in the air, an unspoken anticipation, as if everyone present knew they were about to witness something profound. Tomas stood at the front of the room, his posture straight, but no longer rigid with the confidence of absolute certainty. His dark eyes scanned the sea of faces before him, students who had looked up to him as a beacon of reason, a man who wielded logic like a sword in the fight against superstition. But today, there was no battle to be fought. Instead, there was only a story to be told, a story of doubt, loss, and ultimately of transformation. The lecture hall was packed. Word had spread that Tomas was returning to deliver a lecture unlike any he had given before. His previous absence had sparked rumors, whispers of a breakdown, speculation that the great professor had finally been undone by grief. But no one had expected what was to come. The room fell silent as Tomas cleared his throat, the faint sound echoing through the space. He rested his hands on the podium, his fingers brushing against the worn edges, grounding himself for what he was about to say. Gone was the man who had once used this platform to tear down the notion of faith, to dissect belief with cold, clinical precision. In his place stood someone different, someone humbled by the journey he had been on. "Today," Tomas began, his voice steady but softer than the students were used to, "I'm not here to debate or to present you with a series of logical arguments. I'm here to share a story. My story." The students shifted in their seats, some glancing at one another in surprise. This was not the Tomas O'Connell they had come to know, the professor who spoke with absolute certainty, who left no room for ambiguity. This was a man who had been changed. "For most of my life," Tomas continued, "I believed that the world could be explained entirely through reason and science. I believed that anything outside of that framework was either a crutch or an illusion. I built my career on these beliefs. I built my identity on them." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The room was so quiet that the sound of someone shifting in their seat echoed faintly in the background. "But 6 months ago, something happened that shook the foundation of everything I thought I knew. My wife, Amanda, died in a car accident." His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on, determined to share the truth of his experience. "Her death left me questioning everything, not just my philosophy, but my very existence. For the first time in my life, I didn't have the answers. I couldn't logic my way out of the grief, and I couldn't reason my way through the pain. Tomas's gaze fell on a student in the front row, a young man who had once asked him in class, "What's the point of it all, Professor?" At the time, Tomas had answered with a cool, detached explanation of existential philosophy. Now, that answer felt hollow. "I was lost," Tomas admitted, his voice softening further. "I didn't know where to turn. For someone who had always relied on reason, it was terrifying. I was grasping at the edges of my own sanity, trying to find something, anything, that could make sense of what had happened." The room was tense with silence, every ear attuned to Tomas's every word. And then, he continued, something unexpected happened. "One night, in the middle of my darkest moment, I heard a voice. It wasn't something I could explain with logic or science, and believe me, I tried, but the voice was real. It said, 'I am with you, Tomas.' And for the first time since Amanda's death, I felt comforted." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some students exchanged skeptical glances, while others leaned in, captivated by the vulnerability in their professor's voice. Tomas took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment, his moment of truth. I fought against it. I resisted the idea that there could be anything beyond what I could prove. But eventually, I couldn't deny it any longer. I began to explore faith, not with the intention of disproving it, but with the intention of understanding it. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. And what I found was something I had never expected: peace. The word hung in the air, almost as if the room itself needed a moment to absorb it. "I didn't find all the answers," Tomas continued, "but I found enough. Enough to make me realize that maybe, just maybe, there are things in this world that we cannot quantify, cannot explain, but are no less real because of it." The students were riveted now, some leaning forward, others sitting back with crossed arms, processing the implications of what their once steadfast professor was saying. "I'm not here to tell you what to believe," Tomas said gently. "I know many of you, like I once did, see faith as something incompatible with reason. But I've learned that the two can coexist, that they aren't enemies, but perhaps different parts of the same truth." He stepped away from the podium, moving slowly across the front of the lecture hall, his hands now free, open. "I've spent my life trying to disprove the existence of God, to show that belief was an unnecessary crutch for those who couldn't face reality. But in the end, I was the one who couldn't face reality. The reality that there are mysteries far greater than we can understand. And that's okay." Tomas stopped, standing in the center of the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of his students. "I'm not asking you to believe what I believe, but I am asking you to consider this. Maybe the most profound truths aren't the ones we can prove, but the ones we experience. Maybe truth is something we live, not something we argue." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a blanket. Tomas could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken questions, the silent grappling with new ideas. As a philosopher, he concluded, "It's my job to ask questions, to explore the unknown. But as a human being, I've come to realize that there are some things we can't understand, only accept." He returned to the podium, his hands resting lightly on the surface. "So, I leave you with this. Search for truth in all its forms. Don't be afraid to question everything, even yourself. But don't dismiss the possibility that there's more to life than what we can see, hear, or touch. Sometimes, the answers we seek aren't found in books or theories. Sometimes, they're found in the quiet whisper of the heart." With that, Tomas stepped back, his lecture complete. The silence that followed was heavy, not with discomfort, but with contemplation. The students remained seated, processing what they had just heard. For many of them, it was a challenge to reconsider the rigid boundaries between faith and reason, to open themselves to the possibility of something greater. As Tomas gathered his notes, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had spoken his truth. He had shared his journey, not with the intention of converting anyone, but with the hope that his story might inspire others to seek their own. As he left the lecture hall, the sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. And for the first time in a long time, Tomas felt at peace, truly, deeply at peace. His journey was far from over, but it was no longer one he walked alone. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.